I'd like to introduce you now to Professor Nils Melzer, a special rapporteur on torture, a professor in Glasgow, and also the chair of human rights at the Geneva Academy of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. You have the floor for the keynote speech.
Well, after this, it is difficult to say something that could be more relevant than what we have just heard. But thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to take the floor in this important event, this important launch event. Dear friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, as has been said, today we celebrate International Human Rights Day. Today, 71 years ago, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this historically unique and extraordinarily powerful instrument which arose from the ashes of World War II and recognized that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. Now, epitomizing a new world order based on human rights and dignity, its Article 5 proclaims that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Today, hardly any norm of international law commands as much consensus and authority as the prohibition of torture. It is universally recognized, as has been said, as absolute, as non-derogable, and as peremptory. It protects all human beings without discrimination, in all situations, without exception. It cannot be restricted, even in war and other situations of public emergency. It cannot be abolished even by treaty. And any contradicting legislative, administrative, or judicial act is not only inherently unlawful, but even originally void. That's what jus cogens, what peremptory law means. States must prevent torture throughout their jurisdiction. They may not transfer anyone to another jurisdiction where they may be exposed to torture, and they may not use any information obtained through torture in any jurisdiction in the world. And in criminal law, we know that violations of the prohibition of torture invariably figure among the gravest offenses, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. And torture must always be investigated and prosecuted as a matter of universal jurisdiction. This is, in a nutshell, the international law on torture. In reality, however, torture is, as has been said, still practiced with disturbing frequency and near complete impunity in all regions of the world. To this day, not a single country in the world can claim in good faith to have completely eradicated such abuse. Torture is used to interrogate, but also otherwise to coerce, to intimidate, to punish, to discriminate. It is used to break resistance, to force confessions and silence witnesses, to extort money, sex, or cooperation, to deter migrants, exploit labor, and subdue political opponents, and to terrorize, disempower, and humiliate a wide range of dissident voices and, as has been said, marginalized segments of society. So every day, people are being prevented from leaving or are extradited, deported, returned to countries where they face near certain torture, rape, or murder. Every night, countless children, women, and also men face violence, abuse, and even death in their own homes, often with the complacency of their communities and the acquiescence of the state. This, too, is torture. In recent years, it has become increasingly acceptable for politicians to promote responses to terrorism, narcotics, and criminality and migration that are clearly incompatible with the prohibition of torture. And even contemporary mainstream entertainment portrays torture as an effective means of last resort in the everlasting struggle between good and evil. So what has gone wrong? How can reality deviate so drastically from one of the most authoritative legal provisions ever codified in human history? Does the prohibition of torture no longer reflect the moral imperatives and utilitarian pragmatism of our time? From a moral standpoint, torture, along with slavery and genocide, doubtlessly has come to exemplify the absolute and unforgivable evil. Even those who openly promote coercive interrogation generally do so under the guise of euphemisms, such as enhanced interrogation or pressure techniques. And they may even refer to specific methods, such as waterboarding or stress positions, but they would never admit that they are advocating torture. This moral consensus that torture is outlawed absolutely is remarkable, given that for most of human history, torture actually was common practice and morally accepted as a byproduct of absolute power. The peremptory prohibition of torture has grown out of the horrors of World War II, and it is no coincidence that it begins to erode again precisely at the time when the last witnesses of those horrors are passing away. The moral imperative of the prohibition of torture still is a fairly recent achievement, too recent perhaps to be sufficiently immune to bad faith attacks in the face of purportedly existential threats. The problem is not that the prohibition of torture does no longer reflect our moral values, but that our common perception of torture no longer reflects the reality of torture. That we have become totally disconnected from the dirty truth of what torture really is and what torture really does, not only to its victims, but also to its perpetrators and to any society that tolerates such dehumanizing abuse. It is not true that methods such as waterboarding, stress positions, or sleep deprivation, or prolonged solitary confinement are somehow different than torture. They all aim at inflicting excruciating pain or anguish for purposes of interrogation, intimidation, or punishment. They are plainly torture, nothing else. Contrary to what mainstream TV makes believe, it is also not true that such methods could ever be used in a sanitized way, as some kind of half-legal means of last resort to neutralize the threat of the proverbial ticking bomb that we have mentioned several times today. The reality of torture is dirty. It is ugly. It stinks of vomit and blood and excrements. It is sickening, it is heart-wrenching, and is absolutely horrifying. Listening to you brought flashbacks in my mind of all the people and victims I've listened to in the last 20 years, and I felt almost sick in my chair listening to your story because I could feel the reality of your experience coming through your voice, although I don't speak your language. But we have a common language. But no one who has ever faced the reality of torture could ever still cling to the illusion of it being compatible with humanity, with dignity, and with any notion of respectable and responsible human life. Those who know the reality of torture, who have suffered it, those who have inflicted it, and those who have tried to heal the physical and mental and emotional wounds resulting from it know that torture destroys deeply. It destroys utterly and irreversibly. That it destroys not only the physical and mental and emotional integrity of the victim, but also that of their torturer and that of their families and that of the society and ultimately the moral and the cultural integrity of mankind as a whole. Torture, dear friends, is the moral abyss of mankind. It is where we sacrifice our humanity on the altar of our fears. It is the total capitulation, not only of our personal integrity, but in its extreme consequence, it is the very end of civilization itself. Let us not fool ourselves. The truth is that any tolerance, any complacency, and any acquiescence concerning the threat or the use of torture, however exceptional and well argued, will inevitably lead down a slippery slope towards complete arbitrariness and brute force, ultimately ending in disgrace for all of humanity. So unless we wake up rapidly from our collective amnesia and stop the current downward spiral, humanity may well have to learn the same lesson again the hard way. From the utilitarian perspective, we rightly celebrate today scientific evidence demonstrating the ineffectiveness of torture for the extraction of reliable information. But we tend to forget that these findings do not come as a surprise to the torturers themselves. Throughout history and across cultures, interrogators, prosecutors, judges may have been cruel, corrupt, or indifferent, but the inherent unreliability of any information extracted under excruciating pain cannot possibly have escaped their common sense. The only convincing explanation for the continued use of interrogational torture throughout all times and contexts is that its primary purpose never was to find the truth, but always has been to dictate the truth or to suppress the truth or to otherwise dominate and coerce and intimidate, tasks for which torture is indeed very effective. The real paradigm shift, therefore, of non-coercive interviewing lies not in scientifically demonstrating the ineffectiveness of torture for the extraction of reliable information, but in unveiling and demasking the true purpose of all coercive interrogation. It exposes how ruthlessly states practicing coercive interrogation are betraying their own lip service to the letter of the law, and how complacent or even complicit they are with the corrupted logic of forced confessions, which so conveniently intimidate opponents, which produce culprits where we need them and scapegoats, and reduce the judicial caseload in short, effortless, and inexpensive proceedings. But this also makes a complete mockery of human dignity, justice, and the rule of law. Ladies and gentlemen, as inhumane as torture may be, it is not only inhumane, but also an inherently human experience. Torture is seductive, just like the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. It promises the knowledge of good and evil. And just like the serpent's lies, the whispers of torture invariably lead into an abyss of cruelty, darkness, and self-destruction. Torture may promise power and control in times of threat and vulnerability, but much like an addictive drug, it delivers nothing but illusions, shame, and a growing sense of desperation which can only be suppressed by ever higher dosages of the same drug. More violence, more coercion, more domination, more pain, more suffering, more humiliation. How else can we explain that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has been put through the agony of drowning to death on the waterboard, a grotesque 183 times, without any reliable intelligence being extracted? How else can we explain what you went through? Although there was an obvious mistake in your arrest in the first place. But these cases are just emblematic examples for the poisonous entrapment which resulted from the CIA's fall for torture after traumatic events of 9/11. It illustrates the legal and moral dead ends of any attempt to whitewash organized cruelty, and shows the viciousness with which systematic torture corrupts not only the integrity of the investigative process, but also the capability of constitutional checks and balances to ensure effective oversight and accountability. While the US Senate Committee's 7,000-page report of 2014 has been celebrated as a historic victory of American democracy, unfortunately that victory has been immediately lost to classification, extensive censorship, and total impunity for all perpetrators, instigators, and accomplices. Without transparency, investigating the truth is but a fig leaf for complacency. Without accountability, however, it turns into outright complicity. We must understand that torture is not only incompatible with human dignity, not only an ineffective fact-finding method, but that it also cripples any subsequent judicial proceeding, as all information so extracted from the suspect automatically becomes inadmissible as the so-called poisonous fruit of torture. We must also be aware of the mortal dangers for democracy and the rule of law which arise from governmental secrecy and impunity, both of which are inherent in any state policy of torture. So unfortunately, in failing to ensure accountability for the crime of torture, the United States has set a deplorable precedent which has already found zealous apprentices elsewhere in the world. Most notably, despite the parliamentary investigation reporting substantial British involvement in CIA torture and extraordinary rendition, the UK government recently, in July this year, officially declined to allow a judicial inquiry into the matter. Israel openly justifies special interrogation methods that repeatedly have been reported to inflict severe suffering and injury. And the European Union, Australia, and many other countries around the globe do not appear to see any problem in adopting and implementing policies and practices knowingly exposing thousands of irregular migrants to rape, torture, and murder in other countries every day, right on the doorsteps of their fortified and militarized borders. Given the contagiousness of these policies and practices, even among states traditionally committed to democracy and the rule of law, this book, Interrogation and Torture, is not only timely, it is overdue and may well be a last-minute wake-up call before we are heading towards another one of humankind's dark ages. In order to overcome the scourge of interrogational torture, neither its absolute prohibition, nor its universal moral condemnation, or its demonstrated ineffectiveness for any legitimate purpose are sufficient in themselves. By integrating all three perspectives and cleaning up with a broad range of myths and misconceptions, the authors contributing to the book, Interrogation and Torture, jointly expose the ugly truth of torture and make an incontrovertible call for the eradication of coercive interrogation in fulfillment of the promise made by the Universal Declaration 71 years ago, that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a time for hesitation or compromise, but it's a time to speak out clearly, to pull our strength and resources together, a time to renew our spirit and our values, a time to focus and to push ahead. The responsibility to fight against torture and to uphold human dignity falls on all of us, on you, on me, and on countless other men and women in all corners of this planet. For it is us who elect and tolerate our governments. It is us who turn a blind eye on the suffering of our neighbor. And ultimately, it is all of us who together determine public opinion. There is no guarantee that us speaking out will stop mankind from taking another collective tour through the darkest depths of human nature. But to do all we can do and still to fail is one thing, but to fail to do what we can do is quite another. Speaking out against torture and cruelty comes at a price, but then keeping silent also comes at a price. As far as I'm concerned, I would rather pay the price for speaking out than the price for remaining silent. Thank you.